Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 10, Lesson 2, the George W. Bush Administration. The election of 2000 was significant because it's the first presidential election of the new millennium, this new century that we've emerged into, and also there's some issues with it as it unfolds. But before we get into that, let's look at who George W. Bush is. He was the son of President George H.W. Bush, the president who ended the 80s into the 90s. At the time he ran for president, he was governor of Texas. He had been governor of Texas since 1995. And he won the presidency after winning the closest election in U.S. history. Bush's opponent in the 2000 election was Vice President Al Gore, Clinton's vice president. And the Democrats were weakened because of this scandal that occurred leading to the impeachment of President Clinton. So a lot of people were not so keen on electing another Democrat. They wanted a new face, a new party. Al Gore was also weakened by third-party candidate Ralph Nader. And as we've seen in previous presidential elections, the third party always weakens the election of whichever main party they're part of. Ralph Nader happened to really be a Democrat, and so Democrats who were party loyal were split between Nader and Gore. And at that point, we've also seen a downturn in the American economy at the end of the 1990s leading into the 2000s, which a lot of people blamed on the Democrats as well because they were in office at the time. The biggest issue at this point is who actually won when polls closed at the end of the night on Election Day. And it looked like Gore won by popular vote by 500,000 votes. But Bush appeared to hold a narrow lead in the state of Florida. And at this point, there's questions on were those votes really accurate? Because at that time, they didn't use electronic voting like we do today. It was little punch cards. And thousands of those punch cards had not fully punched the hole in the paper. And so some people were saying, well, we're not really sure if they actually voted for him because it didn't punch the hole all the way through. So this controversy comes about because there is such a narrow margin between the two presidential candidates. So Al Gore at this point demands a recount because he's just adamant that he won and they need to make sure that these were correct. So during the recount, voting machines ignored the ballots that were incorrect, the ones that didn't have the holes punched all the way through. And so Gore demands at this point a recount by hand in 4 Florida counties. 4 of the biggest counties in Florida with the most voters. State officials certified that Bush was the winner of Florida's Electoral College vote. And so this goes to the Florida Supreme Court because Gore is just still adamant that he won. And the Supreme Court of Florida ruled by a narrow 5-4 margin to end the recount. It was taking way too much manpower. It was way too much time to sit there and look at the tiny little dots to see who actually got the vote on each and every single ballot. And some of the people were like, okay, well, let's take it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Florida says we got to end it. Let's take it all the way to the top. But the U.S. Supreme Court said there's no standards for reviewing the ballots. There's nothing in the Constitution about recounts. And so it ended there. George W. Bush becomes president and is inaugurated in January of 2001. Looking at Bush's domestic policy, one thing he did was push a tax cut in an attempt to revitalize the economy. By the time he comes into office, the economy is waning. We're moving into a small recession. And so he believes that if he cuts taxes, that's going to put more money in American people's pockets that they can then put back in the economy and things will get better. But his tax cut really mainly favored the wealthy people in the country. This tax cut, called the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act, very long name, was meant to stimulate the economy, and the major provisions were to reduce marginal income tax rates and reduce and eventually repeal an estate tax. As a result, this saved taxpayers, but it was really not even. Tax cuts benefited the high-income individuals the most. Those top 1% of households saw their average tax rates fall by 4.1% compared with only 2% or less of normal middle-class households. In addition, it increased U.S. debt by $1.35 trillion over a 10-year period. So it didn't really work the way it was intended. And one of the major things that George and Laura Bush believed in was education. And they still do to this day, as a previous president and first lady very much believe in education. So one of the major bills that was passed during his first administration was called No Child Left Behind. And this required all states to test all students in English and mathematics from grades 3 through 8 to ensure that these kids were learning what they needed to learn and were mastering that information. This was not the beginning of standardized testings by any means, but it did continue the standardized testing into the new millennium. And then just a few short months into his first administration, 9/11 happened. On September 11th, 2001, Islamic fundamentalist terrorists boarded 4 different airplanes. They then hijacked those airplanes and threatened to kill the passengers and crew. Their end goal was to take out the American economic system, the political system, and the military as a means of crippling America so badly that they could then come in and take over. So on that morning, a bright sunny morning, these terrorists flew the planes into both World Trade Center buildings in New York City. That's the economic center they tried to take down. One into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which is the military epicenter of the United States. And then one plane crashes in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And this one, we believe, was either meant for the Capitol building or the White House. But those passengers found out what had happened and actually took the terrorists down because they felt as though the loss of their lives was better than losing significantly more lives on the ground. So that's the reason that that plane crashes in Pennsylvania. These terrorists had been in the United States for a while. They trained to be pilots in our country. This was not something that had been a spur-of-the-moment idea. This was planned, it was crafted, and it was executed exactly as they wanted to do it. It was not just a spur-of-the-moment event. And the mastermind behind it, the guy who takes full responsibility for it, is Osama Bin Laden. This is not the first time we've seen this guy. He formed an organization called Al-Qaeda back in the late 80s or so. And he comes out and takes credit for these terrorist attacks. He writes kind of a manifesto. Yes, I did it, and here's why. And in this manifesto, he kind of goes into detail on why he did this. And it comes down to 4 main reasons. The first one, going way back, is this U.S. support of the nation of Israel. And since its founding in 1948, America supports the predominantly Jewish nation, while some Arab governments in the Middle East have fought against it. And these extremists want to force Israel out of existence. And this is restated from his first, what he calls a fatwa, which is his manifesto, basically. His next reason is the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. After the Persian Gulf War ended in 1991, the U.S. didn't pull completely out of Saudi Arabia. We kept a force of 5,000 troops in that area to support a no-fly zone in southern Iraq. And so he's not very happy about that. He also doesn't agree with U.S. blockades and sanctions on Iraq. He says that America was committing acts of aggression against the Iraqi people. And then his most predominant statement of why he did this was he hates American values. And he's basically saying, their leaders are self-appointed. They're democratically elected government. The freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And that comes from a speech that President Bush gives to Congress a few days after 9/11. But in this fatwa, he gives out his reasons why. Bin Laden comes from a wealthy Saudi Arabian family, so he's not Iraqi. But he does believe in Muslim ideas. He takes it to the extreme. So it's important to understand that not all Muslims are terrorists, but most terrorists are Muslim. But it's a very extreme version of the religion. So this is not normal Muslim activity, and not all Muslims believe the way these extremists do. After 9/11, Bin Laden was sheltered by the Taliban-controlled government of Afghanistan. And so initially, we go into Afghanistan to try to find him. The Taliban is a group of Islamic fundamentalists, so they're Muslims who believe the way that he does. And so that's why they support him, and they kind of take him into their country and hide him. And they refuse to give him over to the United States. It takes the U.S. almost 10 years, from September of 2001 when this happens, till May of 2011 to capture this man and kill him. So a lot of people at this point were wondering, what is terrorism? This is not something that was prominent in American society until 9/11. And so it's important to understand by definition what this word means, because it's still very prominent in our lives today. It is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation against civilians in pursuit of political aims. 9/11 is a very good example of terrorism because this is an unlawful use of violence. They're intimidating us because they're flying our own planes, killing our own people, and they're pursuing political aims. They don't agree with how our government is run. So in turn, let me take out all your stuff so that we can put our government in place. After 9/11, President Bush vowed to get back at them. And he launches a global war on terror. This war on terror is targeted against any nation that harbors terrorists. So at this time, it was Al-Qaeda that then morphs into ISIS later on. And this all occurs in October of 2001, when Bush orders an air and ground assault to destroy all Al-Qaeda bases throughout the Middle East. But Osama Bin Laden still eludes capture. Like I said before, he's not captured and killed until May of 2011. But 9/11 completely transforms the United States. This is the first time that we've been attacked by a foreign power on our own soil, our own mainland soil. And it really transforms many aspects of American life. For example, several organizations are created after 9/11 to ensure the safety of the American people. The first one is the Transportation Security Agency, or the TSA. These are those guys with badges standing at the checkpoints at the airports before you get on your flight, checking you to make sure you don't have anything you're not supposed to. Airports completely change after 9/11. Prior to that event, you could just go into an airport, go sit back at the terminals, watch the planes take off and land. It was no big deal. After 9/11, because those terrorists were able to get back there, get on those planes, they had box cutters, they had knives, but they were still allowed through. We needed to take more restrictive measures to protect our people. So this is why now you're only allowed, certain sizes of liquids in your carry-on baggage, and they check you and make sure you don't have any metal on you, and you have to go through the scanners and the metal detectors, and they look at your baggage. This is why. 9/11 is why. All passengers and luggage were subjected to very thorough screening, and still are almost 20 years later. We also create the Department of Homeland Security. In 2003, President Bush creates this cabinet group with a mission to keep the United States secure from all threats. Those threats that he felt could range from nuclear detection, intelligence coordination, protection of high government officials, and surveillance on known terrorists. This also leads to the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001. And just like in previous wars, this act greatly expands the government's law enforcement powers. Law enforcement officials and intelligence agencies can now conduct searches and surveillance. They cannot do so without probable cause, but this is the act that makes people always think the government's watching them. But they're not watching normal civilians. They're watching people that have given them a reason to watch them. And they are allowed to detain immigrants and monitor bank accounts as well if they feel as though that person is a threat. Now, they're not going to do, under the Patriot Act, they're not going to do this unless they have probable cause. Instead of imprisoning the suspected terrorists here on the U.S. mainland, we take advantage of Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which is a portion of Cuba that the United States gained after the Spanish-American War, and we continue to have control over that area. So we begin using it as a prison, and that's where President Bush sends the suspected terrorists that were captured in Afghanistan. The rights required by the U.S. Constitution did not have to be given to those accused because they weren't being held in America. Unfortunately, it comes out a lot during this time that there was a lot of abuse and torture going on in Guantanamo Bay. Waterboarding is one of the techniques that was supposedly used. And this really turns Americans off of using that site or needing more restrictions and more oversight of the site because they didn't feel it was right to torture people. And so a lot of people began protesting. They felt as though, those in Guantanamo Bay felt as though this was a way of getting information. But the American people felt that it was rarely successful to use torture and it's not necessary. They claimed the prisoners were treated inhumanely. Even some of the people thought they were innocent. So many Americans at this point want Guantanamo Bay closed for inhumane reasons. Unfortunately, it's still open. There are greater restrictions now and greater oversight, but it is still open and we do still hold terrorists there. Later, we move into Iraq. Saddam Hussein rears his ugly head again. And Bush feels as though he might be providing biological, chemical, or even nuclear weapons to Islamic terrorists in the area. And he's afraid this guy's helping Osama Bin Laden. America knows him well. We dealt with him in the Persian Gulf War. And we don't want him aiding and abetting terrorists. Hussein had used chemical weapons against the Kurds in the 1980s, so we know he's capable of doing these things. And so Bush basically says, hey, we hear you've got weapons of mass destruction. And this was a term that was thrown around quite often in the early 2000s. Weapons of mass destruction. These countries have weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein's like, I don't have any weapons of mass destruction. And he refused to allow the United Nations inspectors to search his country because basically they're like, okay, well, give up your weapons of mass destruction or we're going to come in and find them anyway. And he's like, no, you're not coming into my country to find something that doesn't exist. So Iraq was warned, either give up your weapons or we're coming in. He again was like, no, I'm not letting you come in and I don't have any weapons to give you. And so in 2003, we do invade. In March of 2003, Bush gives Hussein 48 hours to leave Iraq or face invasion. Hussein's like, I'm not going anywhere. So at the end of that 48 hours, the U.S. began its campaign with a series of airstrikes. Kind of a scare tactic almost. At that point, Hussein's dictatorship quickly collapsed, and he was eventually captured by Americans. We then turned him over to the Iraqi government, where he was executed in 2006. But we didn't leave Iraq. Hussein was defeated, but we stayed. A lot of Iraqi prisoners were held at Abu Ghraib. It's a prison in Iraq where a lot of them were tortured and humiliated. Kind of similar to the picture that we can see here at the top. And a lot of Iraqis were very unhappy that there were American and British and UN troops on their soil because they didn't believe that those troops needed to be there. By the end of 2006, as many as 1,000 people were still being killed in Iraq each month. But we still didn't leave. President Bush announced a new surge strategy later. He sent more than 20,000 additional U.S. troops to Iraq, and the whole purpose was more than 1,000 people were being killed every month. He felt as though it was the United States' obligation to try to protect the people and guard the borders. So that's why he sent more troops. This did greatly reduce the violence in Iraq. Obviously, there were still terrorist cells within the country, but it does greatly reduce the violence. And so some people see this as a victory, but a lot of Americans start to see this as us sticking our nose in business that isn't ours. So there are Americans that go against the war in Iraq, and there are some protests that break out around the country, but for the most part, people support our being overseas and trying to contain the terrorist organizations because everybody remembered 9/11 and nobody wanted another one. Back on the domestic front, in 2005, we see Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. This is within Bush's second term. He's reelected in 2004. And this hurricane is one of the largest hurricanes to ever hit the area. And it causes mass devastation, especially in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. This led to the evacuation and flooding of almost 80% of that city. People were stuck in their homes. Most of the homes were completely flooded. People were sitting on their roofs because they couldn't get out of their house because they couldn't get through the water. People were using boats to get everybody out. While the hurricane leads to some of the largest storm surges on record, the real issue with Hurricane Katrina is the levees failed. Levees are walls that hold back water, and New Orleans has many of these because the city itself is below sea level. So to keep the waters of the Gulf and the waters of the Mississippi River out of their city, they built up these walls. Unfortunately, the walls were not very well maintained, and with those storm surges, the levees broke. More than 1,800 people lost their lives in that flooding. Even more than that, lost their homes and everything they owned. The city's low elevation also contributed to a lot of the flooding, because as those levees broke, the water just surged into the city, and because it was so low, it just continued to flow. Towards the end of the George W. Bush administration in 2008, we see one of the worst financial crises since the Great Depression. The stock market crashed, and the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to try to combat the crash. And the crash did not cause as much devastation as it did in 1929, but many people took advantage of the lower interest rates and they bought homes because they were like, oh, great, interest rates are lower, I can afford a house. But then if you don't pay your mortgage, your house gets taken away. And because the stock market crashed, a lot of people ended up not being able to pay their mortgage. So the banks would lend money to the borrowers who were buying more home than they could afford. By 2007, overbuilding led to falling house prices because they had more houses than they had buyers. So this caused prices to go down higher. Supply leads to lower prices because the demand for those homes is simply not there. So when the interest rates began to rise, people could no longer afford those mortgages. This leads to the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act in 2008. And this is a way that George W. Bush tried to fix the problem. It authorized the Secretary of the Treasury to spend up to $700 billion to provide funds to banks to help bail the banks out. And a lot of people saw it as exactly that. It was a bailout. The thought process was, we're going to give the banks this money. This is going to prevent the banks from failing. They're trying to use the Great Depression to their advantage and trying to figure out how to fix it. It also gave emergency funding to brokerage houses and banks that would help to be able to end this recession. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and the recession ends up going into the Obama administration that we'll talk about next week. This brings us to the end of Unit 10, Lesson 2, and I hope you have a great day.